We'll now turn over to Rachel for some initial thoughts and reactions and sort of questions both to IEG and to the World Bank, and then after that we'll sort of throw it open and take questions from people in the room and maybe online as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been invited here as a discussant today as somebody who's had one foot inside the process. So myself and Anna McCord contributed various background papers to the evaluation that was led by Jenny. And somebody who's probably also got one foot outside, so I'm not completely focused in my work on the bank and what it does. And so what I want to do is really talk about the 6 main recommendations and findings in the report, and then perhaps raise some questions about, well, what does that mean for what we're going to do in the future, both in terms of the future World Bank strategy, but in terms of what all the rest of us do as well. So the first big recommendation, there's a finding that social safety nets are much more focused on chronic poverty and vulnerability and on human development than they are on responding to either systemic or idiosyncratic shocks. And it got me thinking, well, why should the World Bank focus on idiosyncratic and systemic shocks? If it's good at focusing on chronic poverty and on human development, should it stick with what it does? And I was thinking through whether a response to shocks, if they are real, unpredictable shocks, maybe that's not the job of the bank. Maybe there are other agencies in the UN that are actually better placed to take on that gambit. And that got me really thinking about how far, when we're developing strategies, whether it's the World Bank strategy, whether it's the UNICEF strategy that's emerging really soon, whether we need to spend more time talking about strategies across different donor agencies and thinking about our respective additionality or value added, rather than doing it in isolation. And I also wondered, in the context of the report, whether Jenny, you might tell us, when you talk about shocks, whether you're really talking about or suggesting that the World Bank focuses more on shocks as an objective in its safety net programming, or whether you're actually saying what we do needs to be more flexible so that there's a bit of a capacity to respond when a shock takes place, which is, I think those two things are slightly different things. And that kind of brings me on to another idea, which I'll talk about a few times, which is, what's counter-cyclical safety nets? What are they going to look like over the next 10 years in the context of a global slowdown? And those good years, or those stable years, when are they going to come? Are we actually going to have any? And so what does a counter-cyclical process mean in that context? The second thing was really about adopting a systems approach, and some of what I'm going to say resonates with the challenge that Laura just raised. Absolutely, we should all be moving away from very specific projectized approaches into systems. But I was thinking about what donor systems look like, and thinking that generally donors tend to design a very similar system everywhere they go. And I was thinking, in response to what Laura says, donors have operational parameters and they tend to have preferred instruments. So how are we going to engender a more open approach to instrument selection? Because if we don't, we won't get to a systems approach. We'll just remain stuck with specific donors, pushing forward the instruments that they are used to, that they have technical expertise in. The third thing about social safety nets engagement in LICs, in low-income countries, I think this is probably the area where I've got most to say. I guess my starting point is that I can't imagine that a World Bank business as usual approach, the way in which it's worked over the last 10 years, is going to be particularly helpful in taking it forward into working more in LICs. And I was trying to think through what might need to change in terms of a World Bank approach if it is going to effectively engage in social protection systems in LICs. And I've just flagged up 4 things off the top of my head that I think would warrant a lot more debate and discussion. One of them is about wage rates in public works programs. So there's a general bank orthodoxy that in public works programs you pay below the prevailing agricultural or local wage rate. And I was thinking, what does that mean in a context where poverty rates are high and where labour markets are very thin? Does it still make sense to have that kind of an approach? I was thinking, in LICs, would you need a system where you have much more grant funding through the World Bank and less lending, so less repayment? And what would it take for the World Bank to shift into that kind of mode? Is it even possible for it to switch to more grant funding? Then I was thinking about targeting, and there are generally preferred instruments of targeting within the World Bank for social safety nets, and I'm wondering how well means testing works, or how well proxies work in contexts where poverty is generalised across the whole population. And if your poverty rate's 80%, is it really worth trying to find the 20% that aren't going to be in the programme? And then finally, a question about the appropriateness of CCTs, and particularly of the C in CCT, the conditional bit, in contexts where the supply side is far less effective, where there aren't schools, there aren't teachers in schools, and this idea that in some places applying a conditionality to a cash transfer programme is, in the worst of scenarios, almost like applying a tax to poor people. If you've got to walk to the health clinic for a day, then you've got to queue up for a day in order to get a stamp in a book, then walk home again. It takes you 3 days to comply with a condition. Does that make sense? And then again, this idea, I think particularly in LICS, comes up about if the basis for a social safety net's rationale is based on a counter-cyclical system, I'm not sure that makes sense in countries that simultaneously face acute and chronic poverty and vulnerability. They're not two things that are alternatives. Acuteness is about severity, and something being chronic is about longevity. And if you have those things at the same time in countries, how does counter-cyclical work? The fourth point was the idea about short-term versus long-term results frameworks. And I think the first thing that I'd like to say, having been through the process of evaluation with Jenny and other members of the team, is that I was pushed all the time into interrogating the evidence in front of me much more than I've ever been pushed in an evaluation with any other donor. And I think there's a real positive to that there's no, I think I look at the evidence that we sometimes use to make the case for social protection, and I think a lot of us need to tighten up a lot more. You hardly ever see controls, and I'm not saying that RCTs are the gold standard and that's what you should be doing, but I don't think we pay enough attention to comparators. We might make comparisons between different kinds of programs, or we might add up what the benefits of a program are, but we don't compare them to lots and lots of different kinds of interventions outside the sector. And so I don't think we're very good at the counterfactual stuff, and I think we need to get a lot better at that. And I learned a lot about that from being part of this process. But I think the other thing about the short-term and the long-term results framework is that going through this process, Jenny and I spent a lot of time on bumpy roads in Ethiopia, I think debating or arguing about what sustainable means in the context of a social protection programme. And to me, in Ethiopia, the idea that something has to be government-owned and government-funded within 5 years in order for it to be called sustainable stopped making sense. If you've got a country that's been in receipt of ODA for decades, why on earth do we think that something's only sustainable if it works after we've done it for 5 years? It started to make no sense to me, and we spent a lot of time toing and froing about that. The fifth thing that I was going to say, and probably not, because I've got another mnemonic, but I think I'll just leave us with the SMART mnemonic instead. And then just finally a small point about the things that were raised about bank internal coordination resonated with me in lots of different ways. They resonated in terms of the way that we work on social protection at ODI, where we have a social protection team, but we have other people in other programs who also work on social protection. It also resonated in terms of that debate that happens constantly in Africa about whether the responsibility for social protection should sit in a central non-sectoral line Ministry of Economic Planning and Development, something like that, or whether it should sit in a sectoral ministry, a Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, a Ministry of Food Security and Rural Development. And I had kind of two ideas on that. One of them was let's stop talking about where social protection should sit and who should do it, and let's get focused on what our objectives are and then work from there. So start with the problem that you're trying to tackle and what you're trying to do rather than the name of what you're doing. And then the second one was I was wondering about maybe we should stop trying to shoehorn social protection into being an individual sector or objective. Because when I think about ODI and perhaps about the World Bank as well, I think it's the institutional messiness that enables us to find a bit of space to do something different or innovative or to challenge some of what's going on. So I was wondering whether it might be worth talking about internal coordination as you know, how do we capture the good bits and not straitjacket ourselves into a you do one thing, I do the other thing across an organisation. So they were just some ideas to perhaps get a conversation started.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Rachel. I like the idea of the sort of obliquity, which I've seen focusing around that, you know, maybe sometimes you don't come at things directly, but you kind of get social protection by doing other things or doing it under other labels.